Okay, so I'm late, of course, and I just randomly started this. I was gonna set a new time and do all this other stuff, but I just decided not to. So what we're gonna be looking at, and I guess people can just view it later on. We're gonna be looking at this Epiphany magazine, the strong delusion of the Marxist faith. So open this up, and it says um, the purpose of Epiphany Journal are to proclaim the living gospel of Jesus Christ in the contemporary world, to promote an integral Orthodox Christian worldview based on Holy Scriptures, patristic doctrine and praxis, and lives of the saints as the salvific alternative to godless secularism, to provide the foundation for the restoration of a fully Christian way of life based on discipleship, community, sacramental initiation, to preserve the heritage, the essence, the elements, arts, and crafts of traditional Christian culture founded on Eucharistic liturgical life of Holy Church, to defend the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the pillar and ground of the truth in an age of apostasy. Okay, so this little intro, and it says on the 6th of March 1917, just as after the outbreak of the revolution, it says Father Aristocleus said that now there had begun the judgment of God upon the living, and there would not remain one land on the earth, nor a single person whom this would not touch. The beginning would be in Russia, but it would continue from there. He said nothing whatever consoling, and yet the whole time he said, quote, but do not fear anything, do not fear. The Lord will reveal his miraculous mercy. That was from the Orthodox Word, Volume 9, Number 3. And we're going to get started. So, okay, we have here, it says, inside the Marxist faith, a young idealistic Lionel Urquiza hoped that Marxism and Fidel Castro would establish justice in his homeland, Cuba. Um, he joined the Communist Party and at the age of 23 became the commissioner in Castro's Ministry of the Interior. One of his duties was to supervise soldiers in the prison camp called La Cabana. After a few conversations with a group of political prisoners there, he said, quote, they told me before I came here that I would find criminals, drug addicts, empty, stupid men with no ideals, but it hasn't been that way. I've seen revolutionaries who helped the revolution come to power, students, professionals, campesinos. You men are not what they told me you were. In a few more meetings with these men, he learned of the underlying doctrinal objectives of the Cuban Communist Press and of its highly selective editing. Shortly thereafter, and his own father was declared a quote non person for refusing to participate in a Sunday work outing for quote volunteer laborers. Lionel, I think it's Lionel, became bitterly disillusioned with the system he had always defended, and then made, quote, the grave error of trying to defend the prisoners on humanitarian grounds from a wave of severe repression which the prison authorities were planning. He was found guilty of, quote, ideological weakness, and soon found himself locked within the same prison system he had once helped manage. Before his encounter with the prisoners, Lionel was not very different from social conscious idealists in our own country and in the liberal democracies around the world. However, most of us not worked closely enough have not worked closely enough with the wills of the communist power, as did Lionel. Uh, and and as did the Orwells, Berdievs, the Kostlers of a previous generation. To share in his disillusionment, instead, we tend to suspect the truthfulness of reports of communist atrocities. Even if we admit that some, quote, mistakes have been made, we generally will not let them tarnish our understanding of the quote, true ideals of Marxism. Did not Marx, like Christ, teach love for the poor and downtrodden? Did he not recapitulate St. Paul with his call to hold on to all things in common, to provide for each other according to the need, and require of each according to his ability? When we gaze upon the abuses all over the world of capitalist imperialism, uh, I, this is, I think this is like coming from him or so. I don't know what this is right now, but we may come to feel that the communist agenda is almost Christian by comparison. Oh, I see what they're doing. After all, bourgeoisie capitalism started destroying traditional society long before the communists set to work, in Engels' own words. The bourgeoisie had stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has turned away from the family, its sentimental veil, and reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. One is also like to hear today that the Christian churches have a terrible history of supporting oppressive capitalists and tyrannical dictators. What Christian is not embarrassed by this? Would it not be better to accept some form of socialism, to look what with complacency upon the suffering caused by the greedy capitalism? The lore of Marxism is intellectual as well as ethical, and many throughout thoughtful people have accepted dialectical materialism as a scientific law of social life. Engels said, just as Darwin discovered the law of evolution in organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of evolution in human history, that the production of the immediate material means of life form the foundation upon which the form of government, the legal conception, the art, and even the religious ideas of the people concerned have evolved. Given our materialistic climate of thought, many philosophical minds still gravitate towards Engels' appraisal. A cloud of justification for Marxism is now common among socially conscious Christians, and this is understandable, for we've gotten our Marxism at second hand. It is a cloud which rises wherever good intention and unprincipled thinking meet the left learning propaganda so prevalent in the media, including much of the Christian press today. It is a cloud that should be dispersed, however, for it grows increasingly toxic and it blinds us to some of the most dangerous currents of our time. A review of communism in the light of Christian conscience and principles should help to show clearly the true nature of Marxism, and this issue of Epiphany is offered toward that end. It says the destruction of the person. So it sounded like it was for it, but it's kind of putting out the delusion of it, that it has this appeal to it that kind of you know, and I think from my study of it, communism is a really great example to look at sort of the antichrist spirit in the world, because it appears to be good on paper, but every time, it's sort of just man trying to become God without God or something. It's very very strange in that way. Hello. So it says the destruction of the person. In practice, whether in the Soviet Union or in Central America, communism as always corrodes the dignity of the human person. Remember the words of O'Brien to Winston Smith in Orwell's 1984. Quote, "You will be hollow, we shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves. All the torments of the Russian gulags are only techniques scientifically designed to bring about this perfect enslavement of the person to the state, and so are the mass persuasion techniques practiced through party controlled arts and media in all communist countries. All the recent propaganda, notwithstanding the quote sneezing, or the squeezing rather, and the filling process today unabated. Communism in principle and in practice requires the total submission of the person to the state. It absorbs all freedoms under a totalitarian control. It subverts spiritual concerns by its uncompromising materialism, and it barricades minds from the truth by its enforced ideology. It cannot tolerate nonconformity born of free will. Quote, "You are a flaw in the pattern, Winston. You are a stain that must be wiped out." If a scripture reveals the human person is made in the image of God, then tyrannical dehumanization is blasphemy. For, to paraphrase St. John of Damascus, the dishonor rendered to the image passes over to the prototype. But this is only to prove through effects what Marx declared in his doctrine. Communism is essentially militant anti-theism. This is suggested also by even a brief review of Marxist philosophy and anti-philosophy. Indeed, it is. Yeah. So it says, in a radical denial of essence, dialectical materialism ascribes all reality to matter in flux. This ascription is a stained attempt to make a non principle intelligible, unqualified matter. However, it does not have an existence of its own, nor does it provide a causal principle of any kind. Yet it is this non-entity that the Marxists invoke as a ultimate reality, the explanation of human history and the touchstone of their revolutionary project. For all their espoused scientism and hatred of superstition, Marxists, like the Darwinists before them, are ruled by a faith in a truly unfathomable mystery. It is a faith, not in the super essential light who gives being to the world from above, but in the darkness, pre existent matter, which lies metaphysically, quote, below existence. This non-entity, then, is the proximate source of the denial of thought and perception, the banality of art and culture, and the reduction of the imago Dei to the faceless Soviet man that communism casts over all the world. Strictly speaking, the most that can be said of matter is that it is substance determined by number, that is, by quantity and extension. In keeping with its principles, then, Marxist society always works to make of its citizens identical units. The hellish prisons and camps are reserved for those who insist on demonstrating personal character, and to make its dominion universal. Dialectical materialism denies in its principle the existence of an absolute supernatural being who gives meaning and existence to goodness, truth, and beauty. And the force behind this principle must be recognized as a mind and will to negation, an intent that is, in the words of Milton's Satan. It says, to waste his whole creation or possess all of our own and drive as we are driven, the puny inhabitations, or if not drive, seduce them to our party. This would surpass common revenge against God. This is to say that Marxism has a spiritual source lying beneath its metaphysical, quote, source. Christians must stand in uncompromising enmity to this ruinous mind and will, for they are the lovers of the Creator and Redeemer of all. Though Marxist rhetoric justifies the persecution of the church as merely the extinguishing of a counter revolutionary superstition, the truth is that the elimination of Christianity is the central concern of the will to negation. A final victory over the church is the very key to Marxist success. For the church is the saving enclosure of goodness, truth, and beauty, the seed of a new creation, the deification of the human person, the fortress of the absolute and holy Trinity. Against the ethical claims. In response to the ethical claims of Marxism, Orthodox Christian philosophy teaches that in this fallen world it is sometimes necessary to choose a primary good, even if it is organically united to a secondary evil. In the words of Father Sarah from Rose, for example, he says, for example, the political and social order of Imperial Russia was primary good, because founded on God and orthodoxy, joined to secondary evil, moral defects of some of its representatives, social injustice, etc. While the revolution, even at its best, offered a secondary good, the correction of injustices, joined to primary evil, the overthrow of God ordained order, the installation of atheism. This is the key also, in Askalov's view, to understanding Antichrist, who will seem, quote, good to those who have lost the Christian hierarchy of values, and do not see the warfare against Christ and his church hidden beneath the mask of humanitarianism. Marxists also are quick to say that the church is persecuted because it has always sided with the oppressing class against the poor. But this ideological saw does not stand the test of historical fact. In Cuba, for example, many Roman Catholic bishops helped Castro come into power out of their compassion for the poor and suffering under Batista's regime. It was these Christians among the Cubans most zealous for justice that Castro imprisoned and shot when he finally revealed his communism. No communist hatred for Christians is not born out of humanitarian concerns. Rather, it springs from the essence of that will to negation at the heart of communism. For example, those executed in Castro's prisons had no doubt about the real nature of their danger to the state. They shouted to the firing squads at the fateful instant, Viva Christos Rey! Long live Christ the King! Down with communism! That was from Stephen Moratori. Okay. So, and there's a photo here of a man in El Salvador, a church destroyed by aerial bombing. Um, okay. Okay, so now we're going to get to this article called Communism and Christianity. It's by Nicholas Berdyaev. We've kind of okay, so it says, in many of his opinions, Nicholas Berdyaev departed far from Orthodox Christianity. In this excerpt from his work, however, we find only the acute perception of a man who experienced for himself the first enchantment, then disillusionment with Marxism. He leaves no doubt that it is anti-Christian by nature. Reprinted with the permission and the publisher of The Origins of Russian Communism by Nicholas Berdyaev. University of Michigan, 1987. Okay, so I've read a little bit of his work before on stream. I think. But anyway, it says the question of the relation of communism to religion, and particularly to the Christian religion, requires special consideration. The implacably hostile attitude of communism to all religions is no accidental phenomenon. It belongs to the very essence of the communist general outlook on life. The communist state, in fact, is the dictatorship of a general outlook on life. The communist regime is an extreme atheism, atheism, uh, etatism. I don't know. And in the state, in totalitarian absolute demands and enforced unity of thought, communism carries a persecution of every church, and above all the Orthodox Church, on account of the part that it has played in history. Communists profess a militant atheism, and they are compelled to carry on anti-religious propaganda. Communism is, in actual fact, is the foe of every form of religion, and especially of Christianity. Not a social system, but as in itself a religion. It wants to be a religion itself, to take the place of Christianity. It professes to answer the religious question of the human soul and to give a meaning to life. Communism is integrated. It embraces the whole of life. Its relations are with no special section of it. On this account, its conflict with the other religious faiths is inevitable. Intolerance and fanaticism always have a religious origin. No scientific, purely intellectual theory can be so intolerant and fanatical. And communism exclusively as a religious faith. The Russian religious temperament, Russian sectarian, and schismatic philosophy play an immense part here, but an irreplaceable militant attitude to religion was foreordered by Marx himself. Marx, in his introduction to the criticism of Hegel's philosophy of life, said that religion was the opium of the people, a phrase which has acquired so definite a meaning in present day Russia. Marx thought for the liberation of the working class and consequently all of mankind, it is necessary to tear religious feelings out of the human heart. Marx said, quote, not religious freedom of conscience, but the freedom of conscience from a religious superstition. Religious beliefs reflect human slavery to the elemental powers of nature and the irrational forces of society. They only exist only until man, social man, finally overcomes the elemental and irrational forces which surround him with mystery. In his thoughts on religion, Marx was the pupil of Feuerbach. Feuerbach? Feuerbach? But he developed Feuerbach's thoughts in a social direction. Feuerbach was the greatest genius in the atheistic philosophy of the 19th century, with a very acute mind and with many gifts for the anthropological philosophy in general. Feuerbach, as it well known, desired to convert theology into anthropology. To him, man was not made in the image and likeness of God, but God is made in the image and likeness of man. Religion is but the expression of man's highest nature, withdrawn from man, become alienated from him, and transferred to the transcendental region of another world. Religion has impoverished and despoiled man. The poor man has a rich God. All his wealth is transferred to God and communicated to him. Belief in God is the expression of man's weakness, poverty, and slavery. The man who was strong, rich, and free would have no need of God. Everything that was highest he would have in himself. From this, Marx drew the conclusion that belief in God keeps the proletariat in slavery, poverty, degradation. Religious beliefs give an illusory, fictitious consolation. They transfer victory into an unreal sphere, and therefore are a hindrance to real victory and liberation. The triumphant the triumphant proletariat will dispose of all illusory, fictitious consolations of the other world. It'll realize victory here upon the earth. Marx's teaching about the illusions of the consciousness, religious and ideological illusions which reflect man's slavery and dependence, his weakness and humiliation, is taken from Feuerbach. But Marx gave the teaching about the illusory nature of consciousness a more sharply social character. Marx's militant atheism requires above all a change of consciousness. Religious beliefs must be destroyed not by imprisonment and persecution, but by revolutionizing thought. And this has happened as a result of the revolutionary class war of the proletariat. Marx was particularly interested in the conflict against religious belief during his youth. To him, it was above all intellectual conflict, as it was also for Bruno Bauer. He found himself in the current of the left Hegelianism, uh, left of his interest in question and connected. It says at the bottom of the page, Marx thought that for the liberation of the working class, and consequently all mankind, it is necessary to tear religious feelings out of the human heart. Okay, so as we're seeing this, this is kind of like a continuation of what I was doing. The last reading, Man Against God, from Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age. This book actually has an excerpt from that book, and I thought I would just kind of go here to continue on that, and maybe I'll cut back to that another. I kind of jump around because I get bored. Uh, exactly. That's Hegel's whole idea that man was sort of indebted to the state. So, the state replaces God, and man is indebted to the state. He has no real value without the state, and he should be basically, bowing at the feet of the state because the state's the only reason he's alive. Um, that's the view. So it goes on. The working out of a general outlook weakened, and he concerned himself chiefly with economic problems, but he remained a militant atheist. Still, it should be said that anti-religion with Marx took a less extreme form of expression than with Buchanan in Russia or with Düring in Germany. Düring, who represented a type of socialism opposed to Marxism with an anarchist tendency, says outright that in social society, religion would be prohibited. Engels, who wrote his principal book in the form of criticism of Düring's philosophical and social views, even takes exceptions to this prohibition of religion of his. Militant enlightenment usually assumes the form of militant atheism. Reason having mastered itself and liberated itself from the traditions in which it was shackled, set itself to oppose belief in God. This is always on a transitional stage in which reason fails to recognize how much it depends upon negative emotional reaction. At a more mature and actually more free reason, and recognizes its limits and changes its attitude to religious faith. An enlightening reason in Russia is in its first militant stage, and it is wholly swayed by emotions. This is to be seen in Lenin. Christianity, Leninism, and the class struggle. Lenin was a passionate and convinced atheist and hater of religion. I use the word, quote, atheist, although I do not believe in the existence of pure atheists. Man is a religious animal, and when he denies the true and living God, he makes himself the false gods and images and idols and worships them. Lenin had a very much uh, coarsened Marxist idea on religion. As Leninism coarsened Lenin's own, Lenin had almost a genius for blunt coarseness, and such was his style. To Marx, the problem of religion was above all the problem of changing one's thoughts, combined, of course, with the social conflict. To Lenin, the problem of religion is almost exclusively a problem of revolutionary conflict, and his way of putting the problem was putting and his way of putting the problem was adapted to the needs of this conflict. Lenin summoned men to quote the assault of heaven, but in Lenin's fight against God there is no depth, no profound motive of Feuerbach and Nietzsche, nothing what is revealed in Dostoevsky, no inward drama. Lenin's thought on religion, which are scattered about in his works, were collected together and published separately. One comes across, for instance, such a phrase as this, quote, every little god is lying with a corpse. Lenin gives his definition of religion, and it is rather the definition of a demagogue than of a scientist. Quote, religion is one aspect of the spiritual oppression which falls everywhere upon the masses who are condemned to the eternal labor for others by their needs and their loneliness. And here is another definition. Quote, religion is a sort of spiritual brandy in which the slaves of capital drown in the image of their humanity and their demand for some sort of worthy human. This definition was made as early as 1905. Lenin particularly hated any attempt to combine Christianity with socialism. A forming spirit in the church was a more harmful thing, in his opinion, than the Black Hundred. A progressive and renegated Christianity was worse than regenerated Christianity was worse than old corrupt Christianity. A Roman Catholic priest who seduces a girl, writes Lenin, quote, is much less dangerous than a priest without cassock. A priest without the Crudeites of religion, an intelligent and democratic priest who preaches the making of some little god or other. For you can expose the first priest, condemn him, and get rid of him, but you cannot get rid of the second so easily, and to expose him is 1,000 times more difficult. This category of the priest without Cossack plays no small part in the anti-religious propaganda, and is a category which is very inclusive indeed. Quote, priests without Cossacks seem to include everyone who is not materialist, everyone who acknowledges a spiritual principle in life, albeit in the very smallest degree, and all philosophers who are guilty of any spiritual or idealist learnings. Even Einstein was recognized as a a priest in disguise, because he acknowledged the existence of a cosmic feeling which might be called religious. Lenin hated the very word, religion, and he was sharply opposed to regarding socialism as a religion, uh, as Lunarski wished to do at one time. Lunarch, Lunarski, Lunakarski was also sort of priest without a cusset, because he preached God construction, which is an actual fact was a form of atheism and even militant atheism. But with all Lenin's hatred of religion, he was opposed to the policy which would thrust the religious question to the fore and regard the fight against religion as an independent problem. Distinct from the revolutionary class struggle, Lenin even spoke about the deliberate insult of religious feelings. Though he himself insulted them coarsely, he recommended the reading of the French atheist philosopher of the 18th century. And this shows how much the atheism of Marx and Lenin depends on the bourgeoisie enlightenment of that century. Although the spirit of the 18th century enlightened materialism is very powerful in communism still, the Russian communists, who are specialists in anti religious propaganda, draw a distinction between the radical bourgeoisie. Uh, Hold on a second. This little thing, I skipped over this. This is in the middle page. It says, this state of affairs makes the denial of freedom of conscience and the thought inevitable, and it makes inevitable religious persecution. Um, but it says, draws a distinction between the radical bourgeoisie thought that spread of the Enlightenment world led to the natural dying out of religious beliefs. Religion would disappear of its own accord, without any passionate or violent struggle. To Plekhanov, it was primarily a question of change in consciousness. That is to say, a scientific and philosophical question. Against this, Lenin has set the revolutionary class struggle, the struggle which inevitably becomes persecution. They continually stress the fact that the fight against religion is not scientific, as it was for the men of the Enlightenment, but a class fight, such as authoritative Western Marxists as Kuski and Kunov are also explained as men of enlightenment who do not understand revolutionary class war. Kuski and Kunov were positivists, not dialectic materialists. That is to say, they were infected with bourgeoisie radicalism. Kutsky's book, The Origin of Christianity, was very influential in the day in Marxist circles, and use was made of it for anti religious propaganda in the early days in Soviet Russia. The same may be said of Kunov's book, The Origin of Belief in God. But from that time, the general line was decreed in Soviet philosophy and in anti religious propaganda. Kutsky's and Kunov's books were rejected and recognized as unsuitable to orthodox Marxist Leninism. Kuski connects Christianity with a movement of the Russian Roman proletariat. This point of view was recognized as dangerous, since it might suggest that the working class and peasant masses a sympathy for Christianity. Okay, so hope everybody's doing all right. Yeah, I'm on page 17 right now. What's up? Yeah, appreciate it. What's up, brother? Okay, so I'm on page 17 right now. I'm gonna hit the music box for a second. Um, I need to get some water, and I'm going to continue the reading. So I hope everybody's all right. Maybe it'll, bring some more people in here. I don't know. Which I understand when a lot of people are here because I've pushed this reading off like 5 times or something. So. Okay, alright, we're back. Okay. Alright. Okay, alright. We're back now, and I'm gonna go to this quote real quick before we get back to the magazine, and sort of break down what it is that we're talking about. So, in order in order to appreciate this, one has to realize what communism is. It's not a merely power mad political regime, but an ideological religious system whose aim is to overthrow and supplant all other systems, most of all Christianity. Communism is actually a very powerful heresy whose central thesis, if I'm not mistaken, is chiliasm or millennialism. History is to reach its culmination in an indefinite state of earthly blessedness, a perfected mankind living in perfect peace and harmony. Examine the printed sermons of the Moscow hierarchs again and again. One finds the same theme of the coming of the quote kingdom of God on earth through the spread of communism. This is outright heresy, or perhaps something even worse, the turning aside of the church from its very purpose, the saving of souls for eternal life and giving them over to the devil's kingdom, promising a false blessedness on earth and condemning them to an everlasting damnation. That's from Saint Seraphim Rose. I think it's from one of his letters that he said that. But I mean, it just kind of connects perfectly with what we're talking about here, on this whole communism thing, the strong delusion of the Marxist faith. So it goes on. It says, besides this, Kutsky regarded Christianity less from the point of view of class warfare than as the result of the influence of social environment. That is to say, he tended towards the mechanical, not the dialectical explanation, and that is heresy. Kunov was condemned because he made use of theories of bourgeoisie scholars, for example, Taylor's theory of animism, in order to explain the origins of religious beliefs. He was a positivist, not a dialectician. The purpose of anti religious propaganda required that the religion should be regarded simply as a weapon of class oppression. Every other point of view on religion is regarded as bourgeoisie. Only orthodox dialectic materialism provided the one true meaning of the nature of all religion. A young Soviet philosopher wrote a book on the origin of religion from the point of view of Marxist sociology. During a debate in which this book was discussed, the author was attacked in a threatening way because he says nothing in his book about Lenin's view on magic and totemism. With a gesture of despair, the author exclaimed that in the whole of Lenin's work there was not a single word about magic or totemism, that he did not know what to do. The bearing of this absurd dialogue is easily understood. The work of Lenin are the scriptures, and in the scriptures all problems must have been decided beforehand. The weakest side of Marxism has always been its psychology and Leninism, on account of its prevailing demagogy. Psychology is still more weak and crude and elementary. Even the psychology of the classes and social groups is not even in the least worked out, and its place is taken by elementary moral accusations. Here, Leninists are wholly incapable of a clear intellectual position. Their position is merely emotional. So subtle a domain as the field of religious psychology is wholly inaccessible to them. In its anti religious propaganda, Soviet literature stands at a very low intellectual level, and aesthetically, its style is intolerable. It is quite the most inferior sort of literature in Soviet Russia. The Soviet anti religious caricatures are unusually crude, tasteless, and for all their simple directness, are but poorly understood by the masses of the people. It says in 1932, Stalin signed a 5 year plan for the liquidation of the church. It stated by May 1st, 1937, the name of God should be forgotten throughout all Russia. This allowed for a systematic and unrestrained persecution of the church, but it also heralded the birth of a new catacomb church. I wanted to point out this is that, at what point in America did, materialism and atheism become so prevalent amongst people? Because it seems that this has been growing over time, and maybe at one time, we weren't necessarily an orthodox nation or something, but uh, there was at least a belief in God in some sense, But nowadays, you even mentioned God, and a whole lot of people, especially young people, sort of say, "Well, you're stupid," or they view you intellectually inferior in some way, and they see atheism as, some the dominant philosophical and psych just it's just kind of strange how that kind of works out. And I think it developed, in Russia, and it's hit America in the way that it has through the colleges, communists infiltrating our institutions and sort of fanning the miasma of communist ideology to the youth. That's what this whole woke thing is. And even on the right, um, it's still playing the same game. It's one bird, it's not, it's really not separate. So, a complex methodology has been worked out for the fight against religion. Anti-religious propaganda is imposed as a binding duty upon the Soviet philosophers who are regarded as orthodox, that is to say, who profess the quote general line. Now, when they're using this term orthodox, they're, that's what they mean, this general line of um, Marxist atheism, really. Yeah, the fight against religion. All religion enters into the 5-year plan, which is not only an economic plan, but a plan for the complete reconstruction of life. At the very same time, religious beliefs are recognized as being very much alive among the people, more alive than anything connected with political and economic life, and it is precisely on the religious front that the communists suffer their heaviest defeats. In anti religious propaganda, what are called religious prejudices and superstitions amongst the peasants and laboring masses have to be reckoned with. The method of the anti religious propaganda must take these things into consideration. Can one be a communist, a member of the party, and at the same time a believing Christian? Can one take part in the social program of communism without sharing the communist world outlook? Without being a dialectic materialist and one of the godless? This is a fundamental question, the communist worldview. In contrast with the social democrats, the communists do not admit that religion is a private affair and simply a matter for the individual conscience. On the contrary, they consider that religion is one of the most public and social of matters. The recognition of religion as a private affair, that is to say, the recognition of the subjective right to freedom of conscience, is a regular plank in the liberal democratic platform. And this principle is borrowed from social democracy from liberal democracy. Marx himself having stigmatized religion as, quote, opium for the people, and the greatest obstacle in the way of securing freedom for the working class and for humanity, could not consider religion a private affair. The question of religion enters into the social struggle. Russian communism draws a logical and extreme deduction from Marx's point of view about religion. And this type of mentality is just pushed in our media, our every movie that's out there, it's blasphemous in some sense, and sarcastic and mocking God in some way. And you know looking at anybody that has any traditional view as backwoods and bumpkin and ignorant, and just like supplanting it with dialectic materialism. That's really what it is. And in the other reading, it's from the root of the revolution. of the modern age is nihilism, and that's exactly how people act. They're very nihilistic. They're cynical. They don't want to hear it. They there's a very satanic energy. I've noticed just having conversations, with people, when you bring up anything about God, and part of it's spiritual, because it is, a spiritual reality going on. So there's a spirit of the age and spirit of the, since the 20s and even before, the Enlightenment, it's been growing. But, it seems to me that, man's reached a point where it's like we don't need God. God's dead and we are our own gods, and we make our own rules, and it's very prideful. And people are just stepping on heads to get where they want to go, and you know um it's not good. It's not, like I said, it's nihilistic. um Ego driven, everything's, I mean, that's how I see the world, at least for the most part. Like, the way people act is very ego driven. The question of religion enters into the social struggle. The Russian communism draws a logical and extreme deduction from Marx's point of view about religion, a deduction which social democracy was unwilling to draw because it had absorbed a number of liberal principles. Communists usually called the Social Democrats, quote, social traitors, and by the way, considered them traitors on the religious question. The Social Democrats, while continuing to consider themselves Marxists, admitted people who were believing Christians to membership of the party, even ministers of religion and professors of theology. But this means the social democracy does not wish to be a world outlook. Religious beliefs are recognized as being very much alive among the people, and it's precisely on the religious front that the communists suffer their heaviest defeats. Okay, that's what's stated in the middle of the page, and it says, "Do not wish to be a world outlook. It wishes to be only a political party, only a system of social reform. I'm not speaking of English socialism, which is connected with Christianity far more than Marxism. Communism, on the other hand, does not want above all to be a, quote, world outlook. It is totalitarian, and on that account, the religious question is very important for it. Russian communism, and as a matter of fact, communism in general, is a Russian creation, builds its whole program upon a definite world outlook. In Section 13 of the Constitution of the Communist Party, not only the Russian Party, but also the International, it says that every member of the Communist Party must be an atheist and carry on anti religious propaganda. It was required of members of the party that they break off from every kind of relation with the church. Lenin clearly established the principles by which the communists must be controlled in his relation to religion. He expounded in one sense religion may be considered a private affair. Religion is a private affair in relation to a bourgeoisie state. In a bourgeoisie state, the communists must stand for freedom of conscience, for the separation of the church from the state, must defend the principle that religion is a private affair. But the whole argument changes when it is a question of the relation of religion to the Communist Party, and consequently in a communist state and society. Religion is certainly not a private affair within the Communist Party. It is then the most public and most social matters. Then a merciless fight against religion becomes necessary. The communist, the real integral communist, cannot be a religious man. A believing man, he cannot be a Christian. A definite world outlook is binding upon a member of the Communist Party. He must be a materialist and an atheist, and what is more, a militant atheist. It is not enough to share in the socialist program of communism to make one a member of the Communist Party. Communism is the profession of a definite faith, a faith which opposed to Christianity. All Soviet literature asserts such an interpretation of communism. Communists are fond of emphasizing that they are opponents of Christian evangelical morality based upon love, pity, and sympathy, and that perhaps is more dreadful, the most dreadful thing in communism. On opportunist grounds, an exception is made in case of the workers in this matter of religion, since there still exist among the working class traces of religious prejudices. Those who cling to them may still be accepted into the Communist Party if they share the social program of communism, without making inquiries about their religious beliefs. But in the case of members of intelligentsia, this is not permissible. The story of the Swedish communist um, Hed- Hedlund is very characteristic. He endeavored to assert that religion is a matter for every man's conscience, and that it is possible to be a communist as well as a believing Christian. Hedlund was very sharply attacked for this and subjected to severe treatment by Yaroslavsky, the chief specialist in anti religious propaganda. It was explained to him that within the ranks of communist religion is not considered a private affair. At the present time, a member of the Communist Party cannot attend a church or profess religious beliefs of any sort. More than that, he places himself under suspicion if he shows any coolness in anti religious propaganda and does not profess militant communism. It is very it in its very makeup and in the spiritual structure of its adepts, the Communist Party is something in the nature of an atheist sect, a religious atheist sect which has got the government into its hands. The religious persecution as a necessity. It is ideal to suppose that the religious persecution in Russia is directed only against the Orthodox Church, which was the dominant church and associated in the past with the monarchy in reaction. Sects of, for instance, the Baptists, are regarded as still more dangerous than the Orthodox, and the struggle against them is regarded as more difficult, just because in the past it was they who were persecuted and by not associated with the authority of the old regime. Christians who recognize the justice of communism in the domain of social life are considered more harmful and dangerous than Christians who are openly in favor of restoration of the old social order, engage in counter revolutionary activity. A free thinking atheist and materialist bourgeoisie is to be preferred to a Christian who sympathizes with communism. It can be used for the socialist work of the construction. It is usually indifferent to the question of a quote general outlook, whereas the Christian communists take a breach in the integral wholeness of the communist quote world outlook. It was Lenin who made this pronouncement. Religious persecution is not recommended in the handbooks devoted to anti religious propaganda, and Yaroslavsky, the specialist on the godlessness, says there is nothing gained by making martyrs, but in actual fact they do make martyrs. Priests are reduced to the existence under inhuman conditions. They are les hansi, quote, deprived of the most elementary human rights, uh, pariahs in the Soviet state. It is clearly desired to place the ministers of religion in such a position that they cannot exist. The material and moral position of the priest, against whom no charge of any sort has been brought, is intolerable, so that sometimes they prefer to be put into prison. But besides all this, bishops and priests, and continually being arrested, exiled to Solovsky and shot, communists who go to church are excluded from the party. Soviet employers are dismissed if they go to church. They can attend church only in secret, where somewhere on the outskirts of the town. To profess one's faith openly in Soviet Russia calls for heroism and frequently involves martyrdom. The priest may speak about God only in the church in his professional capacity. Outside of church, he is forbidden to speak about him. Freedom of the consciousness, of course, does not exist in Soviet Russia. The Soviet constitution, which separated the church from the state and proclaimed the freedom conscious, has no meaning whatsoever. Coercion is not only a matter of practice, it enters into the theoretical world outlook of communism. It is a part of its teaching. Representatives of the Soviet government, when they are spoken to about the anti religious persecution, commonly replied that there is no such persecution, that they persecute solely the counter revolutionaries. of which there are very many among the bishops and priests and the believing laity, and that the church is persecuted only insofar as it is the home of reaction and counter revolution. But this diplomatic explanation is contradicted by the fact that in all their writings, which set out their general point of view and of their own faith, the communists demand a militant conflict against all religion. That they will say this conflict is in the realm of ideas and takes no place in thought. And this was the view that Marx took out of the fight against religion. But this is purely theoretical argument. The really important thing is that now the Russian communists represent the government. The state is in their hands, and the state belongs to the period of a dictatorship of worldview, a dictatorship which is not only political and economic, but also intellectual, a dictatorship over spirit, conscience, and thought. This dictatorship has no bones. It's There's something here by Irina Rashulskaya, something like that, translated by Susan Layton. It says, "Could my country be more despicable? Shame unmatched when the nightmare falls, such a boundless store of the lickspill, executioners, holy fools, how you breed your compliant populace, and so keenly destroy the few of your subjects who shun your bartering. Sentence none the less to love you. Guilt lies not only on your scared or trembling. Do your nightingales have no voice? See your tears on cursed crosses glistening, freezing hard in a coat of ice. How your crucified haunt my dream troubled sleep. How soon I too shall be sent for your sake, my dearest, my damnable, down that road of the self same end, down a pathway which skirts the borderline between anonymity and animosity and love, my dishonorable beggarly mother orphaner, bless now my leave." Okay, quite interesting stuff. Um, So it says, a dictatorship over spirit, conscience, and thought. This dictatorship makes no bones about the means it employs and employs all means. This is the state of affairs in idiocracy. It is one of the transformations of the Platonic utopia. It is this which makes the denial of freedom of conscience and thought inevitable. It makes inevitable religious persecution, all controversies in the sphere of theory, ideas, and philosophy, and all disputes in the practical, political, economic world in Soviet Russia are fought out under the banner of orthodoxy and heresy. All those who incline to the quote right or to the left in philosophy or in politics are regarded as inclined to heresy, and the exposure of heretics and the persecution of those who convicted of heresy is continually taking place. But the distinction between orthodoxy and heresy is a religious, a theological distinction. It is not philosophical and political. So what they're saying, they're comparing, this atheistic materialism of communism to the way an orthodox religious person would, view heresy. But the heresy in communism is religion. It's just it's sort of it is anti-Christian. It's a religious belief system that's whole goal is to supplant and subvert and destroy other religious belief systems. But in the same place, it says it isn't one. So but it says, but the distinction between orthodox and heresy is a religious and theological distinction. It is not philosophical and political. When politics are placed under the banner of an orthodoxy, then the state is regarded as a church, and the persecution on the ground of faith and opinion cannot be avoided. Christian theocracy in the Middle Ages was like this, and so is the Soviet communist theocracy. So is Hitler's Third Reich, and so is every state which professes to be totalitarian. I've already said that Ivan the Terrible, the most notable exponent of the theory of autocracy, founded the conception of an orthodox czardom in which the salvation of the souls of his subjects was under the duties of the czar. The functions of the church are transformed to the state. The communist government is also concerned for the salvation of souls of its subjects. It desires to bring them up into the one saving truth. It knows the truth of dialectic materialism. The communist government, which is an unlimited government, finds its motives, power, in the hatred of Christianity, which it sees as the cause of slavery, exploitation, and the darkness of mind, and makes concession in economic politics. It is even ready to grant a certain liberty in art and literature. Communism is changing and it's developing. It is becoming nationalized and more cultured. Communist life is becoming bourgeoisie. And this last process constitutes a great danger not for communism alone, but also for the Russian idea in the world. But there is a domain in which communism is changeless, pitiless, fanatical, in which it is granting no concession whatever. That is the domain of, quote, world outlook, of philosophy, and consequently of religion also. Soviet philosophical literature as a whole is its literature concerned with anti religious propaganda in particular is most enlightened, most fanatical, and stereotyped. The dogmatism of this literature exceeds anything that has occurred in Christian theology. It sometimes looks as though the Soviet government would rather um, go on to the restoration of capitalism and economic life than to granting freedom of conscience, freedom of philosophic thought, freedom to create a spiritual culture. Okay, so wow, it's pretty heavy stuff. um, I appreciate it. Um, what do I think of them? Well, I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I think of them in the historical way that they are thought of. If you really want to know what I think, you could probably look at something like St. John of Damascus on Islam. That's probably one of the earliest texts the Orthodox Christian wrote about Islam. Um, that's what I think. Yeah, it would be too much to go over in a single setting. But anyways, Soviet freedom of conscience. With the apparent intention of convincing the religious segment of the population that they do enjoy absolute freedom of conscience, as well as clarifying unequivocally what is forbidden despite this quote freedom. The local Soviet organs in the USSR published an article entitled, quote, District Councils and Legislation Concerning Religious Cults, an enumeration of the points set forth in the article which will be sufficient to the present regime's concept of freedom of conscience and worship. The newspaper stipulated that the following demands must be observed in accordance with existing laws. 1. It is prohibited to hold a religious service in the open air, to conduct religious processions or other church rituals without special permission from the local organs of the government. 2. It is prohibited to hold general meetings of any religious organization without special permission. 3. The clergy does not have the right to organize special meetings for believers, including those aimed at training for missionary work or religious instructions for children. 4. The clergy does not have the right to organize excursions or concerts of any sort. 5. Parishes are prohibited from organizing any program of mutual aid for its members. 6. Parishes are prohibited from using funds which they have at their disposal for charitable purposes, in particular for aiding churches and monasteries which are, quote, not supported by the population. This concluding phrase seems a very ambiguous and ominous generality. 7. Uh, any sort of obligatory collections and pledges to aid in any church or religious body is prohibited. This point establishes the inadmissibility of soliciting monthly membership dues. However, judging by the Soviet press, these restrictions are not entirely clear since in many places membership dues are collected. 8. It is prohibited to perform religious rites or rituals on children without the consent of the child's parents. This point obviously refers to the sacraments of baptism, confession, and communion. 9. It is prohibited to influence adolescents and children into serving in Orthodox and Catholic churches. 10. In accordance with the Soviet statutes, the church hierarchy cannot issue decrees or obligatory directives to believers or religious bodies. That's from the Russian Orthodox Church, A Contemporary History by Jane Ellis, Indiana University Press, Bloomingdale, Bloomington, Indiana, 1986. Okay, so we're going to go to this right here. This is called the Metaphysics of Atheism, and we're going to probably end after this article on the Metaphysics of Atheism. And I'm going to return with the Psychology of Contemporary Enthusiasm. So that'll be the next video. I don't want to overwhelm anybody, and I don't want to be overwhelmed. So, communist materialism. Doctrine and passion. It is proposed in the following pages to consider communism from a very definitive point of view, the point of view of doctrine. It is not only one, to be sure, which merits attention. Communist doctrine can no more adequately explain the communist phenomenon than Christian doctrine alone can explain Christianity. Communism is also essentially something more than a doctrine. It is, for instance, a phenomenon of passion, one of the most formidable not only of our time, but also without a doubt of history. It would be a grave mistake, however, to imagine that communism does not involve an ideological system, an elaborate constructed philosophy, a doctrine in the strongest and fullest meaning of the word, and primarily, without doubt, a political and social economic doctrine. That is to say, a conception of property, labor, production, exchange, social relations, and the state. Karl Marx's Capital is put forward primarily as a book of political economy, but it is more than that. The political economy, which it describes and completes and synthesizes what is in the fullness acceptation of the term of philosophy, a form of wisdom. Communism thereby professes to offer a conclusive explanation of things, to resolve once and for all the great problems of nature, being life, the origin and destiny of man. Marxism, Plekhanov declares, quote, "It is a complete conception of the world." The materialist philosophy of communism. Marxist materialism on the above mentioned planes finds simultaneous expressions in a philosophical doctrine and in a historical, social, and economic doctrine, but is primarily a philosophy. It it was as a philosophy that it was elaborated in the minds of its authors and only philosophically in its fully inexplicable. We shall confine ourselves for the moment to this first philosophical aspect of the Marxist materialism, deferring the other until some other occasion. The philosophy of communist materialism is roughly as follows. It professes to be an answer to the great fundamental question of every philosophy, and more practically of modern philosophy, the question of the relation between spirit and matter, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the relation between thought and being. Which comes first, spirit or nature? What relation is there between ideas of the surrounding world and that world in itself? In the other words, are our minds capable of knowing the real world? These are the complementary forms of one same problem and shall be considered successively. Spirit and nature. Let us first see what attitude Marxist materialism adopts in the first part of the question, which is the primordial element, spirit or nature. Did God create the world, or has the world been in existence eternally? Quote, the answer which the philosophers give is to this question split them into two great camps. Writes Engels, quote, those who asserted the primary of spirit to nature and therefore in the last instance assume world creation in some form of other. And among the philosophers, Hegel, for example, This creation often becomes still more intricate and impossible than in Christianity. Comprised in the camp of idealism, the others who regard nature as a primary belong to the various schools of materialism. These two expressions, idealism and materialism, Engels continues, quote, primarily signify nothing more than this, and here also they are not used in any other sense. What confusion arises when some other means is put into them will be seen below. Communist materialism, therefore, professes to be a solution of the problem of the relation between spirit and nature, according to that of which of two orders in nature which comes first. Such materialism does not, therefore, deny spirit absolutely, but is content to assert that it is not the primordial element. Spirit does not exist independently of matter. It is in no case a substance capable of a reality of its own. Consequently, pure spirit, God, the immortal soul separated from the body and subsisting after the dissolution of matter, all these fictions devised in the very early times when men still completely ignored all the structure of their own bodies under the stimulus of dream apparitions came to believe that their thinking and sensations were not activities of their bodies but of a distinct soul which inhabits the body and leaves it at death. It is in an exactly similar manner the first gods arose to the personification of natural forces, and these gods, in the further development of religion, assume more and more an extra mundane form, and then finally, by a process of extraction, I might almost say a distillation occurring naturally in the course of man's intellectual development, out of the many more or less limited, mutually limiting gods there arose in the minds of men. The idea is of one exclusive God of the monotheistic religions. Quote, nothing exists outside nature and man. The higher being of our religious fantasies have created only the fantastic reflections of our own essence. Spirit, moreover, is not principle in matter. It is not the principle, the cause of matter. It is the matter, on contrary, to which in the foundation, the structure, the essence of every reality. It is the supreme cause of itself and the spirit in all its forms. Spirit is but a superior expansion of matter. Quote, matter is not a product of mind, but mind in itself but a superior product of matter. It is merely a superior form of material energy at work in the world. And yet it would seem that immersed in matter in the full continuity with matter, with every being different in kind from matter, spirit is some way of another overflows matter. And while continuing to be thoroughly dominated by matter, does not fail in its turn to act. And sometimes powerfully upon matter, here the adepts of Marxism do not scruple to protest normally developed in a born idealist, and how in that case can there be any materialist? Karl Marx in Capital asserts the reality of spiritual and the efficiency of spiritual forces, even more categorically if possible, without, however, yielding a tittle of his materialism. As spider carries out our operations resembling those of the weavers, and many a human architect is put to shame by the skill which a bee constructs her cell. But what from very first distinguishes the most incompetent architect from the best of bees is that the architect has built a cell in his head before he constructs it into wax. The labor process ends in the creation of something which, when the process began, already existed in the worker's imagination, already existed in an ideal form. What happens is not merely that the worker brings about a change of form in natural objects at the same time in the nature that exists apart from himself. He realizes his own purpose, the purpose which gives the law of his activities, the purpose which has to subordinate his own will. This spiritual quality also gives man his superiority in the whole of nature, which he is thus the summit and the center. The spirit which materialism denies is spirit with a capital letter, absolute, independent, substantial spirit, considered as the reality par excellence, nay, the sole reality. The reality which nature is but an exteriorization, a degradation, a projection. But the spirit is nature. an expansion of nature. Nature simply overflowing in itself way and asserting itself in its highest expression, that spirit being a superior product of matter. A superior expansion of matter as it manifests itself in man. Communist materialism does not in the least profess to deny, suppress, annihilate. It was in this sense that Feuerbach had already established his materialism as an affirmation of man upon the summit of reality, making him thus, as it were, the central object of philosophy. Materialism, so conceived, is obviously a sort of humanism, wherein it differentiates itself precisely not only from the vulgar materialism which denies all thought, but also by the fact of its emergence of the spirit, from a purely and simply determinist materialism, according to which man whirled along like a pebble in a torrent down in a uh, in ineluctable stream of natural laws, is capable of doing anything to stem the flow. Marx and Engels never cease criticizing such a crude, quote, mechanistic materialism, as they termed it, and to disavow all connections with it. Quote, the materialist doctrine, says Marx, quote, that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, forgets that circumstances are changed precisely by men that are the educator must himself be educated. Quote, there is no autocratic action, as some contrive to imagine. Engel writes in his own terms, quote, by the economic conditions, men make their own history, but it is given environment by which they are conditioned. How otherwise could be primordial importance which the masters of communism attach to the theory be explained? Revolution, although the inevitable fruit of the organic evolution of social reality, is nonetheless the conscious, willful effort of the proletarian masses to break the fetters of determinism, imprisoning them. If historical circumstances could be modified by the human spirit in nature, an expansion of nature, nature simply overflowing in itself in a way asserting itself in its highest expression, that spirit being a superior product of matter, a superior expansion of matter as it manifests itself in man. Communist materialism does not in the least profess to deny, suppress, annihilate. It is in this sense that Feuerbach has already established his materialism as an affirmation of man upon the summit of reality, making him thus, as it were, the central object of philosophy, action, conscious class action. The revolutionary energy of the proletariat would clearly be meaningless. Just as meaningless for the matter, inversely, as bourgeoisie class consciousness, and the energy of resistance shown by the established bourgeoisie order imposing the accession to power of the proletariat. This purely determinist interpretation of materialism gave rise to reformist tendencies, reformists conceiving that it was sufficient to wait for the mere play of economic laws to affect the socialist transformation of society. Orthodox communism, however, has never ceased to oppose them. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for now. I appreciate everybody that stuck with me, and and I think this is a book rather called it's from Epiphany magazine, and it's called The Strong Delusion of the Marxist Faith. And there's a couple different articles. There is an article called Subhumanity, the Philosophy of the Serb by Father Seraphim Rose. I haven't gotten to that yet. I'm pretty sure, what was I just reading from? I'll tell you exactly what I was just reading from. So, The Metaphysics of Atheism by Paris Ducatalian. Okay, so that's what I was reading from right there. I'll come back with this pretty soon, probably tomorrow, hopefully. So I'm Unseen Warfare. Reading from The Strong Delusion of the Marxist Faith. Appreciate everybody that stopped by, and have a good day.